Hello everyone, my name is Robert Chalmers and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Escaping Christianity, and hope everyone's having a good day. I wanted to make this video really quickly because I wanted to address some things I didn't address in part one of this video. So in the last video I talked about spiritual death and how the New Testament writers understood that. And I mostly talked about the dead being in Hades and waiting to go into heaven. At least the righteous dead. They were waiting for Jesus to come back at the second coming so that they could enter heaven. And that's a form of spiritual death in the Bible, this separation in the grave. But it's not the main form of spiritual death that's in the New Testament. The main form, and Paul talks about it a lot, and the other New Testament writers, is slavery to sin, being in bondage to sin. This is what is really meant by the New Testament writers when they talk about spiritual death. There is the separation aspect, being in the grave and waiting to be resurrected, and that's a form of death. But spiritual death is bondage to sin. And so I just wanted to talk about that really quickly in this video and show why this proves that the Christian God doesn't exist. So I have this passage pulled up. It's Matthew chapter 8, and if you look right here in the middle of the page in verse 22, the Jesus character says to one of his disciples, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." So this is someone who's considering following him, and Jesus says to this physically alive person, you don't need to bury your physically dead. But he's calling these physically alive people as being dead. So what is he referring to? He's obviously referring to spiritual death. And so you have this all throughout the Bible. This is very standard Christian teaching. There's nothing, controversial that I'm saying here. But this bondage to sin or slavery to sin is spiritual death. And the only way that you can get freed from that is by the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of Christ, or the Holy Spirit. He's the one who gives victory to a person over sin. So like in Paul's writings, you can see that Paul has a hierarchy. And so he has the Spirit as the top of the hierarchy. Then he has the sin, or the power of sin. And then he has in the flesh. So there's in the Spirit, the sin, or the power of sin, and then in the flesh. And that's the hierarchy in Paul's thinking. So when you're in the flesh, you're in bondage to sin because sin is stronger. And so humans, because of Adam's sin, they inherit this bondage, to sin, and they can't get total victory over it. But if you believe in Jesus, this is what the New Testament writers say, if you believe in Jesus, you can escape the power of sin, and you can live a victorious life over sin, but you're going to struggle because you're in a body that you got from Adam, the physical body, that is corrupted by his sin, and you've inherited it, and so you have this predisposition to be under the power of sin as a human being. And so you commit sin. And so the only way to get freed from that is by the Spirit, and you got to believe in Jesus for that. So to make this a little bit more clear, let me pull up Romans 5. In Romans 5, starting in verse 12, Paul says that sin entered the world through one man, and he's referring to Adam. And thus death spread to all men, to all people, because everybody sinned. And then in verse 14 here, he says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses." He's talking about sin existing before the law was given to Old Covenant Israel when Moses came along. So death still existed from Adam to Moses. And what was this death? Well, it was, bondage to slavery to sin. So like in John chapter 8, the Jesus character says, who the Son sets free is free indeed, because by believing in Jesus, you get victory over sin, and you receive the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit can give you power over sin. But if you don't have the Spirit, you're just in the flesh. You're in your physical body by yourself. And the human will is in bondage to sin because, once again, in Paul's hierarchy, the Spirit is here, the sin or the power of sin is here, and the flesh is here. So when you're in the flesh, sin is stronger and you're in bondage to it. But if you're in the Spirit, because you believed in Jesus and you've received the Holy Spirit, you have the power to live victoriously over sin, but you got to work at it. Paul talks about this in Romans 8, especially verses like 10, 11, 13. You got to work at it. You got to put to death the misdeeds of the physical body by the power of the Spirit. And so this is not controversial teaching. Virtually all Christians understand that this is what Paul and the New Testament writers mean when it talks about spiritual death. There is a bondage of the human will, which of course includes the physical body because humans are physical creatures, and humans their will is not strong enough to defeat sin. Sin has power over them, but if you believe in Jesus, you receive the Spirit and you can have victory. But like Romans 8:13 and other passages say, you got to crucify the flesh by the Spirit in order to get victory. You got to work at it. So I bring this up because I really want to stress the fact that Paul believed that he would not have to struggle with sin anymore when the second coming happened. And this is what Christians have believed for 2,000 years. Almost all Christians have believed that Jesus is coming in the future. They ignore the time statements. That's their problem. They say that Jesus is coming in the future and is going to transform their bodies, and sin will not exist anymore on planet Earth. So there'll be no more spiritual death, no more slavery to sin, and there'll also be no more physical death because their bodies will be transformed. The earth will be changed into a utopia, and and so there's no more physical death, and there's no more sin in the world at all anymore. And this is what Christians have believed throughout their history. So everything I'm saying, none of it should be controversial. So, but I'm bringing this up. So notice in this passage, in verse 14, it says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses." And this is talking about before the law was given. Because like I said in my last video, the last 18 months out of the 32 years I was a Christian, I was a full preterist. And you'll probably never run into full preterists because they're very rare. They've only come along in the 19th and 20th century. They're less than 1%, probably of all Christians that have ever lived. But they are the only Christians who correctly recognize the time statements, that you can't escape the time statements. And so what they do is they say that physical death and bondage to sin, spiritual death, that was never going to be conquered. That Jesus came back in that generation like he promised in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, and that's what the death was. It was just law. It was just Old Covenant Israel under the law of Moses, and the temple had to be destroyed so they couldn't practice it anymore, so that there was no more obstacles for the new covenant and for belief in Jesus and all of that. The curses of the law had to be carried out on Old Covenant Israel for breaking the law and for rejecting Jesus and all of that. And that's the death in the New Testament, and that's the resurrection, is the death of Judaism, and with the temple's destruction, and then the dead could leave Hades and enter heaven. But as you can see here in Romans 5, it simply doesn't work, because Paul says here in verses 12 through 14 that death reigned from Adam to Moses. So this is before the law was given with Moses. So full preterists say that death in the New Testament is simply Old Covenant Israel under slavery to the law of Moses. Not bondage to sin, but slavery to the law of Moses. Well, that doesn't work when you look at these verses, because Paul says death reigned from Adam to Moses. So you can see that here in this passage, but when you go to 1 Corinthians 15, and we were looking at this in the last video, and you had verses 50 through 55 that I talked about, well, look at the verses immediately before it, verses 46 through 49. It says, "However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural." So Paul's talking about you start off as a physical human being when you're born, but if you believe in Jesus, you'll get an immortal spiritual body at the second coming. And he says here in verse 47, the first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. And if you go back to verse 45, it says, the first man, Adam, became a living being. He became a physical human being because this God breathed the breath of life into him, and he became a living physical being. But the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. And this is a reference to Jesus in Paul's thinking. And so that's the context that you see here in verses 45 through 49. So Paul's not talking about Old Covenant Israel under the law of Moses. He's talking about physical human beings. And then he makes this clear after verses 45 through 49 when he says in verse 50 that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. And he goes on, and I covered that in the last video. Paul believed that he would receive an immortal spiritual body that could not sin, that was not in bondage to sin anymore, and he longed for that day. And here's the absolute proof of that in Romans 7, which I covered in the last video too. When you go down to verses 23 and 24, Paul says, I see the law of sin which is in my members. And that Greek word is melos. It's used 34 times. The Greek word is melos for members here. And it always refers to the physical body. And then in the very next words, verse 24, Paul says, O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? So he equates the physical body with body of death. And in verse 18, you can see here, he says that, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. So if the full preterists were right in that death doesn't have anything to do with physical death or bondage to sin, but it was simply Old Covenant Israel under the law of Moses, and that had to be destroyed with the temple in 70 AD, these passages prove that that's not true. The full preterists are not telling the truth, and their system has fooled them. They fooled themselves with their system, because Paul equates it to his physical body, and he believed his body would be changed. One of the things, I pointed out Matthew 16, verses 27 and 28 in the last video. This proves it had to happen in the first century generation. And how I pointed out in Revelation 20, verses 13 and 14, and Revelation 22:12, that everyone would be judged according to their works, and that this would happen in that generation. And the Olivet Discourse, which is in all three synoptic gospels, says the same thing. And I covered the reasons why all those things, not some of them, but all of them, that's Matthew 24:34, had to happen in that generation. And another one, just to point out really quick, is Matthew 10:23. I'll just pull it up like this. In Matthew 10:23, it says, when they persecute you in this city, this is Jesus talking to his personal disciples, the Jesus character. He says, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And sometimes Christians will say, oh, he was just sending them on ahead and he was going to catch up to them. That's what he meant. But you can see that that's not what he meant from this passage, because when you go to the verses right before it, verses 16 through about 22, it says, I will send you before Gentiles, and they will beat you in the synagogues, and brother will deliver up brother to death. And he's talking about things that would happen. And then he says, he who endures to the end will be saved, right here in verse 22. These are the same things he says in the Olivet Discourse. He's talking about things that would happen after his crucifixion. So this isn't something, where Jesus is saying he's going to catch up to them or something like that. Sometimes Christians try to say that. So this is another verse in Matthew 10:23 that says that his disciples would not go through all the cities of Israel before his second coming. So there's multiple passages that say this. I already referenced 1 Peter 4:7, James 5:8, 1 John 2:18, Hebrews 10:37. And you can look at those passages and you can see that the first century Christians were an apocalyptic cult who believed that their Messiah would come back before all of them died, before their generation completely died out. And because they state this explicitly, excuse me, and they also believed that bondage to sin would be eliminated forever at this return, and also physical death would be destroyed as well. Because remember, in 1 Corinthians 15:51 and also in 1 Thessalonians 4, excuse me, we see a transformation of living believers because their body's corrupted. Remember Romans 7, verses 23 and 24. The members are corrupted, the physical body, and Paul says that's the body of death, not Old Covenant Israel under the law of Moses, like full preterists will try to claim. So it's definitely the physical body, and Paul and the other New Testament writers believed they would get an immortal, sinless body where they wouldn't struggle with sin anymore, and that would happen in their generation. So I just wanted to cover this really briefly as a part 2 to the last video, so that a person can know that when they look at these time statements, like Matthew 10:23, Matthew 16 verses 27 and 28, Matthew 24:34 in the Olivet Discourse, and it's also in Mark and Luke, and that there's several passages that explicitly state that it would happen in that generation. So that's all I wanted to say. I wanted to keep this video short, but you can know from this that the first century Christians and Paul, I'm sure they believed that they were communicating. I'm sure Paul thought he was getting visions from his Messiah, from his Jesus, and that the end was imminent. But he wasn't actually talking to a God that existed. He was, hallucinating it. He was coming up with it. However, he was just creating this stuff, and he thought he was receiving it from someone. And these time statements prove that what he was saying wasn't true, because bondage to sin, and of course sin is a concept the Bible comes up with. It doesn't really exist, but imperfect behavior exists, and the Bible calls that sin. And that bondage to sin still exists today. Christians will tell you that they still struggle with sin, even with the help of their Holy Spirit, and that sin is alive and well in the world today, and physical death is also still here. But the New Testament writers explicitly state in these passages that those things would be conquered in their generation, and this proves that, although Paul, I'm sure, believed he was receiving it from a divine source, he wasn't. He was hallucinating, he was making it up, and these time statements prove that. And so I just wanted to get that out there for people to see as part 2 to the first video. I would watch these 2 videos together so you have a comprehensive argument. But this shows a person why the Christian God cannot exist from the New Testament's own words. And remember, Christians say these are the words of God. So there's no way to get around this. And once again, I'm doing this because I want to see Christians freed from a God that doesn't exist and from a false religion. And so I'm trying to help people, but unfortunately most Christians don't listen. But anyways, this argument's out there for you to consider, and I hope it will help you out. And so that's it for this video. I hope everyone has a great day, and I hope that I can talk to you again soon. All right, take care.